Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be our final session of the afternoon, discussing the use of real-world evidence in the life cycle development of health technologies, and specifically how we can apply that to our most vulnerable pediatric, maternal, and fetal patients. So I'm very excited to have a really great panel. Quick introductions, and then we're going to get started. First, we have Siami, who's the Vice President of the NEST-CC program, which is part of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and funded by the FDA. We're going to have Sandy describe that in just a second. She's got an incredible background in medical devices, real-world evidence, and is bringing that expertise to NEST. In addition, we have Howell, who is currently the Vice President for Medical Devices and Diagnostics at Aetion, a company that he will describe to us in just a second. Christian's got a background working in the medical device industry for many years, including as Vice President of value-based care for Medtronic prior to this. So really excited to hear about how these two experts kind of see the future of using real-world evidence, data, the things we've been talking about today to really drive positive impact in our industry. So Sandy, maybe I can start with you, and you can give us a little, I think some people in the room are familiar with NEST, but maybe we could start by kind of talking a little bit about what the NEST program is and how it's structured.
Sure, my pleasure, and thank you for having me. NEST stands for the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, and it's a national, as in the title, it's a national system really developed to be able to generate better evidence for medical devices and medical technologies. First, focusing on regulatory decision-making. And NEST has three kind of main initiatives. Our first is our pre-market, and I talk with my hands, guys, is our pre-market and evidence generation. This is where we use our various sources of real-world data, such as electronic health records and healthcare claims records and registries, in order to generate kind of that required evidence that's fit for purpose. What is, what are we using the data for? Is it for pre-market submission? Is it for post-market surveillance? Is it for health economics or outcomes kind of research and kind of get to that decision making? And these data are provided to us with our network collaborators and data partners that make up health systems, insurance, payers, and registries. And then next is our active surveillance system that we are building. And it's envisioned to be the first of its kind, in that we're trying to build the system so that it is active, right? It's active surveillance versus passive surveillance. And how can we get near real time evidence that's generated there for signal detection, signal trending, signal identification, refinement, safety surveillance. And then finally, we have part of our program is our collaborative community. We were one of the first of the collaborative communities recognized, and with participation from the FDA, CDRH, and we use our collaborative community to help identify potential issues as they relate to medical devices and real-world evidence generation. And then how can we collectively find solutions? Our first project, for example, is UDI adoption, UDI, Unique Device Identifier adoption in the electronic health records. And how can we help facilitate that, for example? What we've been kind of working on is, as NEST was established, we were established using the Medical Device User Fee Act, or MEDUFA funds, to really develop this system. And we have certain commitments that we have to deliver on. But as we're building this system that's envisioned to be central and scalable, we're using elements like kind of the cloud-based environment, our frameworks for research methods, data quality, data curation processes, data linkage and aggregation, device identification and UDI, and of course, analytical cores. And we've been in discussion with my co-panelist at Aetion and other potential partners that may have some of these solutions already, and how can we leverage what's already been developed and make appropriate modifications to be able to do that evidence generation in the medical device space.
Fantastic. So that's a great transition to Christian. So, there's a lot of excitement at the moment around the use of real world evidence. I think a lot of people have seen the utility of it in the regulatory process at the point, as Sandy alluded to, of either getting an indication or post-market surveillance. But how do you see it more broadly in the product cycle development of a health technology device or diagnostic?
Yeah, thanks, James. And one, thanks for having me, and it's great to be with Sandy. I think, in the new world that we're moving into, the idea of real world data and real world evidence is, almost a line item or strategy that innovators and companies need to have across the product lifecycle. So starting in market access to pre-market to commercialization, even into label expansion, I think companies need to be thinking about what are my own data assets and how am I thinking about managing the data that either my device can generate or I'm collecting in research that I'm doing. What are data sources that I should be aligning to, whether that's, as Sandy referenced, electronic health records or claims records or patient recorded, and then ultimately what are potentially novel data sets that I need to be thinking about integrating. But having that sort of longitudinal data strategy, I think is going to become critical, because I think more and more decision makers are going to be asking questions rooted in real world data. I think regulators are going to be asking, demonstrate that it's safe in real world data. I think payers are going to be asking me, show me the cohort within my own data that this should be applied to. And I think providers are going to be asking the question of, show us a cohort that this is something that can be effective on my patients. In case you guys are picking it up in the background, we have a 12-week-old puppy who appears to be being strangled to death in the next room. But I think she'll be fine in just a second.
So, Sandy, any thoughts on that? That's a little bit more expansive view beyond just regulatory. What are your thoughts on the use of data across that product lifecycle?
Yeah, I think the use of real world data to generate that evidence, whether it's pre-market or post-market or health economics or reimbursement or health technology assessments, whatever that spectrum is, I think it's just another tool or tactic that medical device companies can use in their regulatory strategy and have in their arsenal, right? Not every approach is good for every situation. So the more tools that we have that we can plug in and use, and especially for medical devices, in which there's many iterations and many generations of the device as it evolves and as it goes through even a traditional clinical trial, for example. How can we accelerate that evidence generation so that we can get these safe and effective technologies out to the patients, right? Certainly, I think, just to throw in there, I think CDRH recently this year, this year, they released their 90 examples, those infamous 90 examples of where real world data was used for regulatory decision making. I think that's a great start. Hopefully Nest will contribute more to those examples. But I think it's just another tool that we can use in our arsenal to generate that evidence, like Christian said.
Yeah. So Christian, that, when you look at that, the 90 uses from the FDA, a lot of those were adult devices and also pharmaceuticals. And a lot of them were done by large companies who have resources, like your former employer. How do pediatric innovators who are generally charged with trying to be very capital efficient to really build a sustainable business in a smaller market, how do they think about using these tools and when can they access them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that they have to be selective and thoughtful about when in their product lifecycle they want to be leveraging data. I do think that there are organizations, candidly, like Nest, that can help companies that are trying to understand this landscape and understand when a question needs to be answered through a traditional clinical trial, or can it be answered in the real world data? What's the potential research question, and how would that be potentially received from different regulatory perspectives? I think getting those questions answered and leveraging some of the resources at Nest is a great way of maximizing and optimizing investment. I also think that there are certain questions that can be answered in the data as we leverage things like synthetic data, and as we look at rare disease in small populations, and trying to understand where in the past there hasn't been data readily available that would be considered fit for purpose because the sample size hasn't been big enough, that there are now capabilities out there to allow that sample size to grow pretty significantly, maybe not in a regulatory environment, but certainly in a reimbursement or in a provider environment, to start to show the impact and the efficacy of these technologies. So I think it's a challenge for pediatric organizations. They have to be selective, but I think understanding the sort of full spectrum of opportunity for real world data and real world evidence is really important, because then you can start to think about where you want to lean in, where you want to make investments, and where it might not be mature enough and you might want to take a different path. So fluency, I guess, is the advice I would give to those innovators around real world data and real world evidence. And there are organizations that can help you gain that fluency.
So Sandy, I'll kind of, put the similar question to you. You talked about some test cases with Nest and some examples of the work that's been done. If you put the lens of a pediatric innovator, again, challenged with overall generally a smaller market and a more capital efficient path to market, where do you think about maximizing the use of data?
Well, I'm very pleased to say that of Nest's test cases, we had several that were in the pediatric population. And one of our network collaborators, which is PedsNet, kind of contributed with their network to those test cases. And I understand Chris Forrest gave your morning keynote, so he's very well versed with Nest. But the purpose of these test cases or pilots were really to determine the feasibility of using the real world data, as well as to identify any areas where Nest could create these efficiencies. So some of our test cases involving pediatric populations actually found that there wasn't sufficient data to use real world data. And that in and of itself is a learning, right? But because the pediatric population, most of the devices that are, well, if not all the devices that are developed for pediatrics are under the humanitarian use designation, by definition, they're going to be rare. These are orphan devices. We're going to have limited data on a lot of the procedures. And so let's go towards that, reasonable safety and for those devices. Part of our MDUFA commitment, again, was to identify those strengths and limitations of our test cases too. So as our test cases are getting completed, we're having an independent assessment to identify that. And again, identify areas where NUS could play a role to then provide to the larger community, including the pediatric population. And we had an interim report that was released in December, for example, that included 14 of our test cases. That would include information and learnings from the pediatric population too. So those interested can go to our website to download. It's nestcc.org. And it's the RAND interim report, independent kind of assessment. But using this information, and back to Christian's point, it's important to have it as a part of the arsenal, whether that real world data is just using to find kind of what's that natural history, what are the outcomes that I need to identify, or is that real world evidence actually contributing to the pre-market submission? And are we using, again, to Christian's point, synthetic data or external evidence, right? And those methods.
Yeah, so Chris Forrest gave a great talk this morning on kind of the learning healthcare system, which I think is a theme you all are touching on, really from the point of view of being internal. But Christian, thinking of it externally, one of the advantages potentially of PedsNet and being in pediatrics is that we have a much smaller number of major children's hospitals, on the order of 100 around the country, as opposed to 8,000 adult hospitals. Are you seeing, groups like PedsNet that can bring data integrity and bring, cross-platform compatibility? Is that of value, and how are you looking at that externally as they're trying to develop within the health systems?
Without question, because I think those organizations have the opportunity to get much more granular in the quality of the data that they're asking for. And so what ultimately it begins to do is to preserve the integrity of the data coming from a singular source, right? What we are finding is, because real world data is relatively nascent in medical devices, that the more complex research questions that are being asked, what we're finding is we're actually having to link multiple data sets. And you can imagine, as you begin to link these data sets, ultimately what happens is you get a fair bit of washout. And so it actually is one of the benefits when we get into these very specific treatment areas like pediatrics or others, where we find that the registries or the data sets have very high integrity to them, because there's strong kind of control across the contributing data set. So I think, James, to your point, that there's without questions challenges given the sample size and the populations that we're talking about, but the benefit is there's an opportunity to build a very high quality data set in PedsNet and across the pediatric hospital networks, because there can get this alignment on what the key elements that we want to think about. We want to think about retaining in the data dictionary, and it goes to one of the initiatives that Sandy outlined, which is around UDI, right? One of the big challenges in looking at big national EHR data sets is the identification of the device in the data. Oftentimes we're having to use things like NL, natural language processing, against unstructured field in the notes, and it gets very messy. And so if these more, let's call them narrow by focus data sets, can really start to collaborate and identify those key elements, you're going to build data sets that become fit for purpose, and then we can ask the hardest questions against them.
So I know I don't know if you all were on earlier, but Dean Miner opened with a really nice discussion about precision medicine and the use of data, but did comment on the topic that children felt like they'd been a little bit left behind in COVID. Not left behind, but they were sort of second in line, if you will, in terms of the development of vaccines and therapeutics. And we understand there's reasons why. But Sandy, I'd love to hear from your perspective. What do you think went well, or what could we have done better with the use of data to drive, therapeutics, vaccines, et cetera, in the time of COVID for children?
The pandemic forced us to think differently. It put us in a worldwide whirlwind. And we have a lot of learnings from the pandemic, but let me just say, if I could say there was a silver lining, it was that real world evidence and real world data was really pushed into the limelight, and the importance of getting real world data and using the real world data, the secondary use, right? So you couldn't bring in patients into the hospital for their clinical trials. We had many clinical trials that were up and running. So how do you fill that gap through real world data? And I think really having those and having the appropriate frameworks can help bring all populations, whether they're adults or pediatrics or minority or elderly, kind of into the fold. I think pediatric devices have they have their own challenges, because in order to develop and market the device, and I've seen it through my career, pediatric research and pediatric devices happens to be, besides the fact that I had Nest, it happens to be kind of a personal area of interest where I have spent a lot of my career. And they have inherent challenges of their own that Nest unfortunately can't solve, because part of it is what is that priority that we're going to give, that medical device companies are going to give to the development of their devices. But once it is developed, we can help accelerate that evidence generation to get it into the market faster and into the kids, because that's really where we want to focus, right? And making sure we've got that for the patient. So how do we do that? Setting the standards, whether they're research method standards through our framework, our data quality standards, again, through the framework. Our data quality subcommittee also released a data maturity model checklist, both for EHR data and claims data. This is available publicly that people can use, both the data partner and network collaborator, whoever's providing that environment can use, but also companies can use to help evaluate where they're getting the data from, to determine where they are on the maturity and what do they need in a maturity. Again, getting to that fit for purpose. Are they trying to do pre-market research? Are they trying to do reimbursement or coverage kind of research? You require a different level of maturity.
James, can I just add a thought there? So one, I completely agree with Sandy, and I love the idea that you had someone on talking earlier about a learning health system, because to me, these are, if I could find three things that I think are going to be massively accelerated out of COVID. One was, as much of the gold standard as RCTs are, that the most at risk and parts of our population were not covered in those. And we saw that firsthand in the COVID. So we saw without question that the older population and children and pregnant women, we need to find ways of capturing, these cohorts and making sure that we're getting good interventions timely and quickly to them. Two, I think it forced all of us to become much more agile on all, throughout the healthcare ecosystem. And to me, that's what the learning health system is about. It's about healthcare just agility. How do we learn? How do we understand what works? How do we analyze that? And how do we start to drive change management? But the third piece, which I think might be really interesting, and I tried to think about this through the lens of a pediatric device innovator, which is, I think the move toward population health and value-based healthcare changes the conversation about the ROI for big companies like Medtronic and others in investments into devices. Because what it says is, I'm thinking about this less from a volume perspective, and I'm looking at this more from a value perspective. And I think when you change that disposition to value, you can start to really look at population health and at-risk patients and areas where you can help health systems really provide high-level care without the volume being the first priority. And it's the ability to drive value that becomes much more front and center. And I think specifically in pediatric devices, if the conversation moves from volume to value, innovation is going to be accelerated if that's the lens, versus if the lens is just simply about volume.
Fantastic. And that really was kind of a lead into the question I was going to ask, which is what is the future? And I'll let Sandy chime in if she has thoughts on that as well. But I love that idea of, rethinking the RCT. And I really I think you saw with some of the pitch competition participants today, that they were crafting value propositions using novel data sources. And I think that's only going to get bigger. Sandy, any last thoughts on what things are going to look like 10 years from now in terms of the use of evidence to develop highly impactful devices and diagnostics?
Oh my goodness. Let me just say, I don't know about 10 years from now, because I think even 5 years from now is going to be completely different than where we are right at this moment. And that's how quickly the field is evolving, such that I don't think I don't dare predict 10 years from now. But I think once we solve issues related to data privacy, data use, data sharing, which are really, really sticky issues, talking about things like, which are right now considered innovative solutions, like federated learning. How do we incorporate that to help move the needle? A couple of years from now, federated learning is going to be old hat, and something else is going to come up on our radar. But really being able to leverage all of this into interoperability, because that's the next buzzword, right? Is making sure that all of this data and all of these systems are interoperable.
Fantastic. All right. Well, with that, we are up on time. I really appreciate you both joining us. Thank you both for what you do. And I'm sure there'll be interested innovators who will be reaching out to you in the future. So thank you, Christian. Thank you, Sandy.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.